All right, John Loeffler, how are you?
Doing well, doing well.
That's
The sun
good.
is finally showing up again in the Pacific Northwest of the United States.
So you're moving into summer over there, aren't you?
We are indeed.
Yeah.
And Pacific Northwest we have the Pacific flow from Japan, and it's cloudy for a huge part of the time. When the sun comes out, we don't know what to do. We look around and go, oh, dear God, forgive us. What is that flaming ball in the sky? So, anyway.
Most of my audience may have seen the interview that you did with Matt, but just for the sake of the people who don't know you, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, okay. It's better that I do it because when people read my bio, I turn around to see if they're talking about me or somebody else.
Yeah.
I grew up in the U.S. and Africa and Europe, post World War II Europe. Had a chance to see what it looked like in the aftermath of war, and then in 1965 got into broadcasting. Been in there ever since. Met my wife working for a television network, and we have been doing productions together for over 40 years. And in 1990, uh, at the urging of my wife, I got on the air instead of working in the background producing documentaries and things, and began to try to counteract the effects of our establishment media, which we recognized was not telling us the truth, or the whole truth anyway, about stories. And that we called the show Steel on Steel. And we've been on this program now for 30 years, since 1990. And that's the passion. I have a passion for truth. I'm always asking that question. In our show, we analyze things, economics, politics, and religion from a Christian worldview perspective to tell people what's actually going on.
Oh, well, that's good because we're right into worldviews over at the Looking Glass. Um, since you've been had so much experience with worldviews, in your opinion, what would you say a worldview is, um, and how did you come to find out about them?
Worldview, I always like the terms in different languages. We call it a worldview. The German term, which philosophers like to use, is the Weltanschauung.
Hmm.
And that makes you sound like you're really smart when you use that word.
Or have a
Sh-
cold?
yeah, or you have a cold. Schauen is to look at, schauen is to look, on is at, and Welt is world. So it's a way of looking at the world. In Spanish, the word is cosmovisión, a vision of the cosmos. And your worldview is that framework of things that you hold to be true and correct about the world. You look at everything out there through your worldview. And some people have very sloppy worldviews. They just happen along with life. Other people try to formalize it. But understanding the worldview is why, say, for example, today, different groups in the Anglosphere, those of us who live in the English speaking part of the world, as widespread as that is, thanks to the British Empire, we look at it through a particular viewpoint, but now that's been split in that over the last 60 years in academia, they brought in a new worldview. And that's why, to a certain degree, if you notice, even in politics in Australia, although it's not as acrimonious as it is in the United States, where we're shouting, yelling, and beating people up in streets, you have two different groups of people with two different worldviews using two different methods of thought to arrive at two different conclusions about the same thing. And that's why they can't talk. They're speaking English, but they're not speaking the same language.
If you go back, where did you first come into contact with worldviews? How did that first come about?
The best time I ever had, I studied to be a Catholic priest back in 1990, and they sent us over to the local college to take philosophy, logic, and Eastern religions, and also Latin, because back then Latin was still big in the Catholic Church. It cleared up my head. I spent a 1 year with a man, Dr. Milt Danielson, who I'm sure is passed by now, who just absolutely cleaned up my thinking, made me understand what the philosophers had thought, all the way from Aristotle to the current, well, at the time, the current philosophers like Nietzsche and Sartre and others. And that's where I came into contact with it. And then laid on top of that, of course, is your theological worldview, which is a biblical worldview, right?
Hmm.
One which is the basis of law and morality in all of the English-speaking countries, was the Judeo-Christian worldview. what's right, what's wrong. All of that comes out of your worldview.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that is because I was talking about worldviews with someone in particular, and they said, I'm not sure I believe in worldviews. It's kind of like star signs and astrology. And I'm like, no, no, you're getting this all wrong. This is logic. These are logical conclusions that come from a premise.
Well, they can be illogical too,
Oh,
but they are
absolutely, yeah.
part of your worldview. You're right. No, everybody has a worldview. Everybody has one. Some people have sloppy and stupid worldviews, and other people have hard worldviews, good ones. Jesus said, "Build your house on rock." In other words, build your worldview on things that are firm and that will be able to hold in the storms of life, because life is a stormy place.
So how does understanding worldviews help you in your job as a reporter and a researcher?
Well, it helps to give a perspective, not a perspective, but an anchor point.
Hmm.
So when I look at things going on in politics or in the church, you have a standard by which to judge it. There's something that's solid here that you can judge by everything else that's going on out there. There are people, in postmodern viewpoints say, well, you're being judgmental, or you shouldn't judge too harshly, or you need to be open minded. And I'll always say, well, what does open minded mean? Does that mean you believe any slop that comes in at you? And believe me, there's lots of slop out there in thinking. Or that you judge it against something you've already established to be true. And I always say open mindedness is being willing to listen to new ideas. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them or even think that they're right. They might not be.
Yeah, and this whole, like, some people throw around the term culture wars. How do
Right.
worldviews relate to culture wars?
Well, it's what I said before about two different major groups of people now in the Western Anglosphere. Worldview, the old worldview is one that was based on things that had come to us philosophically from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, the Renaissance, and then the Protestant Reformation, especially, which established the ideas of individual freedom and conscience in the West. And the Enlightenment did play a role in that as well. There's no
Hmm.
doubt about that. That's the one worldview that formed the body of law that we have. And the experiment of Great Britain in freedom and its ideas of common law, which all of our countries inherited in one form or another, was based on that. The new form, and it's not really new in all of its assets, is really a combination of postmodernism, which started about 1960, and what I call cultural Marxism, or Antonio Gramscian type of Marxism, which works its way through the cultures. These two things have merged, and it's a separate worldview. It has two different beliefs about religion, the two worldviews, two different beliefs about economics, two different beliefs about politics, and the rough spot is they cannot exist in the same political space at the same time. And that's what all this conflict is going on right now in Europe, in the UK, Australia. Uh, I would say if we are the Titanic in our worldview, then Great Britain is the bow, the United States is in the middle, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are still up in the air. They haven't gone under yet.
Oh, yeah.
They don't, yeah. I mean, so
Yep.
you're better off than we are, but we are where you were 20 years ago. I mean, I'd put it this way: we were 20 years ago where you are today. And so my message has always been, it's coming for you. This war will come home.
So you've mentioned the Christian worldview, you've mentioned the Marxist worldview, and a little bit of the postmodern worldview, and there's a blending between the Marxists and the postmodernists.
Right.
Like, I've taught everybody or shown everybody that there's a secular humanist worldview. How does that fit into politics at the moment?
There's not much difference. It's a real blend that started in the early 1900s. And secular humanism, Gramscian Marxism, like represented by the Frankfurt School, and later on postmodernism, all began to flow together. The early secular humanists, such as John Dewey, who was called in our country the father of American public education, was just absolutely enthralled with what Stalin was doing in Russia to indoctrinate their school children. And he went to the Soviet Union and learned their method and brought it home and introduced it to American public education. And the same thing with the Frankfurt School. They fled from Germany. A lot of them were Jewish by religion or race, and they were also atheists and Marxists. And so they got out of Hitler's Germany, came to the US, set up shop, and began to make this influence. So it's a confluence of three worldviews into, the best thing you can describe it as is a postmodern secular materialism, because it's bits of Marxism, it's bits of humanism, and bits of postmodernism. And we're going through a neo-Marxist phase right now, but due to the technological revolution and the role that technology is playing in censoring things, you've even had trouble with that there in Australia,
Yep.
it's actually morphing into fascism. It's a whole new breed of totalitarianism.
That's interesting. So we still have secular humanist societies in the UK. We have one in Australia. There's one in America. And so you're saying that at the positions of power, so to speak, or the elite level in the world, there's a blending of the Marxism and the secular humanism into this,
Right.
what we have now. But there still are people that would identify as a classic sort of secular humanist.
Yes, that's possible.
Mm.
And they're all fellow travelers. That's important to understand. For the most part, they're fellow travelers. And what we're seeing in the woke experience, as if they woked to the dangers of conservatism, in reality, what they woke to is the fact that a large part of the people hadn't been moving with them over the last 50 years. We kept looking at them going, and you're going, where with this radical viewpoint of yours, And suddenly the woke people woke up in our country due to the elections in 2008 and the election of President Trump to the fact that over half of the population hadn't moved with them. And that's what they have woked to, declaring us now to be evil. That's their viewpoint. We're very evil. And they are the great and the good. And so anything they do to us is okay, even violence. Even though they preach peace, they practice violence. They preach inclusivity, but practice exclusivity. They preach tolerance, but practice intolerance.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, would you say that the woke crowd have a bit of a code for each other? They use language very differently than um, that's commonly used by everybody else, and so it seems that there's this code that they have to communicate with each other. It's almost like you learn a different language that's kind of like English, but the word meanings are different, and in that sense, it presents as a bit of a cult.
It is. It's interesting you notice that because part of the research we did here was what is the nature of cults and what do people have to follow them? And you're absolutely right. I can go through I have 5 characteristics of postmodern thinking that is what affects wokeism. And as I say this, I'm very concerned about even the people who advocate some of these things, like cancel culture. First thing I say to Christians is you need to understand cancel culture cancels Christ,
Yeah.
because these two worldviews are incompatible, period. There's no way you can put these two things together. But since it's based on postmodernism, and if we can just boil postmodernism down simply, it's that there are no absolutes. Remember, they've rejected logic and reason. There are no absolutes. We make our own worldviews and clarify our own values as to what is true or not true. And it is arrogant that anyone should judge anybody else's worldview. Any one culture should judge another person's culture. So that's where this all started from. Of course, it starts off with a fundamental flaw. It says there is no such thing as absolute truth. Well, the first thing you ask them then is, do you believe that absolutely? And if there's no way out of that. You cannot believe there's no absolute truth and then turn around by starting with an absolute. All worldviews, even Christianity, start with a couple of assumptions that they assume to be true. The Bible starts, in the beginning, God. It starts with that, okay? And then created the heavens and the earth. or in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It starts with these assumptions. Atheism says, for example, in the beginning there was nothing, and then nothing exploded for no reason. Okay, that's what they start with, and that's their basis. The woke crowd or postmodernists, I'm going to grab my paper here if I could, I'll read from it. I had to write this out for myself because I couldn't even remember my own definitions. I'm suffering from old age, right? The first trend of it is relative. The relative values of postmoderns don't relate to anything except the moment of what the elite tell us is good or bad, right or wrong, etc. Now, because of that, because there's no absolute that, say, you and I, if we were Christians, we could point to the scripture. We could say, the scripture says this. We could debate that. We have a reference point. They don't. Their reference point floats constantly. The second characteristic is, because of that, it's consensus driven. You mentioned it. You talked about they have this language, and they talk to each other in this, and we call it virtue signaling. And they're virtue signaling to each other. They're the great. They're good. Their ideas are best. They work. Everybody else is bad. And so the whole crowd has to buy into this consensus. This was precisely what President Václav Havel of the Czech Republic wrote in his essay on this very subject, when he said, everybody now, the new totalitarianism in the 21st century is the lie. And everybody has to give lip service to the lie. What's the lie? The lie is that they're right, that it's true. But remember, logic and reason are of no factor in this, only agreement with the consensus. Number three, it's constantly changing. Why? Because it's relative and it's consensus based. And so what may be wrong yesterday will be right today, and vice versa. And so they're constantly changing, constantly flipping everything that the radical left has been preaching since the 1960s. They flipped it over on its head. It's now the reverse of what they said. The next thing is, all of these truths they have are self-contradicting because they're relative, they're changing, they're consensus driven. They even contradict themselves. And you see this. And that's why any person who is a part of the virtue signaling crowd, when he or she steps off the reservation, so to speak, they will be viciously attacked by their own people. You know, in South America, they have a fish called a piranha, and the piranha is just a vicious little fish that it can strip a cow of all of its flesh in just minutes, a whole school of piranha. And it will turn on its own members. As if a piranha gets caught on a hook, the members of the other piranhas will turn on it and eat it. It's just what they do. And so that's why, since it's self-contradicting and everything resolves in this consensus structure, as soon as somebody leaves, they can't tolerate that. That's a threat to the whole structure. And so they must attack that person viciously, even more so than their opposition. And if you notice, when they do the attack, they don't deal in logic, they don't deal in reason, they only deal in cliches and trigger words and those words that you were talking about. That's all they can do. And so the last characteristic is that it's compartmentalized. And what that means is, because there's so many contradictions in everything they're thinking, they create compartments in their own minds. So over here is your religious compartment. Over here is your sex life compartment. Over here is your public life and your family life, and they're all in different compartments. And the only unpardonable sin, Joshua, is to create a hole between the compartments where they can interact. That's the unpardonable sin. They will not allow you to do that. It drives them a little nutty when you do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We could go a lot of places with that. Um, I think where I want to go is immediately, because basically what it sounds like you're saying, or you've noticed, is that logic, because it grounds someone, that has to go.
Yes,
And language also, sort of a common understanding of definitions of words and other things like that, that's also very grounding. That has to go.
correct.
And so you have this group of people who have lost the ability because they've gotten rid of the tools of thinking. So they can't think anymore.
Correct.
And so you need someone as a signal to the masses. And that's where I see mass media coming in, where
That's correct.
they're signaling to these groups who's bad, who's good, who should you follow, who should you not follow, what's good today, what's not good tomorrow. And so media seem to be guiding these groups by a large degree, as well as
That's correct.
politicians.
That's correct. The media, it's like you call it football, we call it soccer. It's like a soccer game. You have referees, right? And all of a sudden, the referees decide they're not content with just judging the game. They want to play on one team. And they've jumped in. And that's what's happened with all of our media in Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They're all playing on one side of the equation. And you're right. All of that judgment has to go because let me see if I can explain this. You or I have, I would say, a firm foundation in our Judeo-Christian belief, in our biblical belief, the belief in what Western society has done. You could come to me and you could propose something. John, I've got a radical idea. And you could tell it to me. And I'd say, Joshua, your head's full of eels. What did you do? I mean, what are you thinking of? But for both you and me, we could talk about it. We could debate it. And finally, either I'd say, Joshua, that's not a bad idea. Or you're full of it. Okay, that's not going to work. For them, any dissent from any part of their worldview is a threat to the entire house of cards. They can't deal with that. That's why they have safe spaces. That's why they have trigger warnings. I'm an adult. I don't need a trigger warning, okay? They need trigger warnings. Beware, what's coming may upset you. Well, tough bones. That's nature. That's the world, right? And you can actually see this. I've had a college president talk to me one time at a private college about what she was seeing in these youth coming into her college that were in this postmodern thought. Because postmodern thought destroys creativity. It destroys innovation and creative thinking. If you give a group of, excuse me, hit my microphone boom there. If you take a group of teenagers that have been trained in the new, what I call postmodern neo-Marxist ideas, and you take a group of teenagers trained in traditional logic and thinking, give them a problem that they have to work through. I don't mean a math problem. I mean just a situational problem you have to work through. The way they do it is two different ways. The traditional group, they're all grounded and they look at each other and go, okay, let's see. Our goal is to do X. Therefore, all right, I will go do this. Judy, you go do that. Come back and the other person go do that. Come back in 5 minutes. Let's see where we are. We break it up. Everybody puts in. If it doesn't work, we got to scrap something and try something else. The postmodern group, the first thing they start doing, Joshua, is they start looking at each other. Why? They're afraid to break the consensus. And so they're trying to figure out how to suggest ideas to the group without stepping over those little red lines that have explosives all along them that will go off if you do it. And a college professor I interviewed one time on my radio show said she gave this group of students the task of decorating the Christmas tree in the entryway to the college. So we're not talking about a little tree, we're talking about a 20-foot tree, right? And about an hour later, they come back and announce to her that they were done. So she goes out and looks at it, and it's decorated right up to about here. Not to the top, just here. And she said, well, what about the rest of the tree? And they said, well, we can't reach it. So she said, did you go over to the maintenance office and ask to borrow a ladder? Well, no. Well, why? See, that would be personal innovation. And that's not built into postmodernism. It's a group of people following a cult-like belief. I had another experience. I was at the gym where I used to swim a lot, and I have a security expert talking to me. He does bodyguard work. And he said, you have to use the OODA loop that the Navy SEALs use. I think the British Special Forces do. Observe, orient, decide, act in any situation. Observe it, look at what's happening, orient yourself to that situation, decide what you're going to do, act on it, come back and start the loop again. And he said, say I'm doing bodyguard work and I'm going to a big reception for international people. And I walk into a room and there are a couple of Muslim gentlemen there in their full paraphernalia, and they have daggers on their belts, on their center waist piece there. Now, two religions, Muslims and Sikhs, have ceremonial daggers. They just do. It's part of the religion. He said, I have to figure out if these guys are a threat. Or is this just something ceremonial? Or could they suddenly whip these out and begin stabbing people willy-nilly? And what would I do then? So as he's explaining this to me, there's a young man listening to our conversation, and the guy just couldn't take it anymore. And he finally says, yeah, but isn't that racist? See, his whole preoccupation was the latest politically correct thing, that we would think of judging people and judging discriminatorily. I turned to the young man, and this really made him flip out. I said, who cares? You're asking the wrong question. The question is, are these gentlemen a threat? That's the question. Race or everything. And you asked that question earlier, Joshua, and that's the reason of it, is that when you and I have a worldview, we orient to that, observe, orient, decide, act on the basis of that framework. To him, he was more concerned that the viewpoint might be racist than that he might be stabbed. And this is the problem you have with these two worldviews. And the tragedy is we let people thinking like that vote because they're making a mess of the political process worldwide.
I remember I've been a subscriber to your show for probably about 15 years now.
We have therapy for that too, by the way.
I'm in therapy, don't worry. I heard you say a really great analogy of a postmodern trying to drive a boat and there's icebergs around. Do you remember that one?
No, maybe you better tell me what I said.
So a postmodern is, if a normal person or someone who has like frames of reference and grounding in their thinking is driving a boat, the Titanic, and there's a big iceberg coming up ahead. The captain comes in and says, turn the ship to port because there's an iceberg ahead. And so someone would normally compute all that in their brain and turn the ship. Whereas when you have a postmodern at the helm, the captain runs in and yells, turn the ship, there's a iceberg ahead. And the postmodern says, don't yell at me.
Right, it's exactly
because there's just no connection to reality. They're being isolated, and that's the occultic process. They're being isolated from these foundations to these reference points, and so everything is about relationship now.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct. A postmodern does not care what you know until he knows that you care. That's very important. Now, inside, postmoderns suspect that something's wrong. A lot of them do. They don't like being in this pressure cooker, and consensus is a pressure cooker. It's like the days of the Spanish Inquisition where everybody has to toe the line. But they don't know how to get out of it. And that's where you and I come in, is number one, we show that I care about them because this is going to chew them up too. Remember, cancel culture cancels everybody, including their own. It always has, and especially in the Marxist world. It chewed up its own true believers. And when you, first of all, you can start talking to them, they trust you, then you can begin questioning them about their worldviews. Well, did you think of it this way or that way? And you can actually see the lights going on in their eyes. You can see it. But they have been indoctrinated. All of our schools, all of the English-speaking world, the public education has bought into this. It is destructive. It's like an autoimmune disease. In the West, we are chewing out our own guts for this. We're just chewing ourselves up in this whole thing. Meanwhile, our adversaries, the Chinese, they're looking at Taiwan. They're amping up their whole military. They're putting ships into the South China Sea at an alarming rate. Russia is the Russia's pulled back now. Well, I take it there. They pulled the troops back, but they didn't pull the equipment back from the borders of Ukraine. They perceive I called it virtual President Harris administration here, because most of us are pretty aware that Mr. Biden is encumbered mentally right now either through dementia or Alzheimer's or something. This is all obvious, but our media are covering that up. They're covering it up. They are waiting for their moment to strike. Israel and Saudi Arabia, they are looking at Iran. Iran has announced that it's going to 60% concentration in its centrifuges. They're well on the way. That JCPOA that President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry worked out was nonsense. It was garbage. It just didn't do anything. And Israel and Saudi Arabia, as strange allies, are determined that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. So the whole geopolitical situation is changing. All of our central banks are pumping massive amounts of money into our economies. They're going to have to keep global inflation under check. It's threatening to just burst out and watch the prices of everything everywhere go skyrocketing again. Those are the realities. And the tension, think of it as I had a rubber band here before. Think of it as a tension between a rubber band between the politically correct narrative and reality is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And you know that sooner or later it's going to go. And when it does, the longer it takes to relieve that strain like an earthquake, the more damaging the blowout that happens after that. That's what we're facing in the world today. You'd never know that. I don't know what it's like in Australia, Joshua. You would never know it from our media in the United States. They're worried about, oh, is there systemic racism here? And that's a creation largely of white elites, not of blacks in academia. That they've created this. They're worried about whether people are offended or this racial group did this or that, or whether we need safe spaces, or whether we should have urinals on aircraft carriers, et cetera, et cetera. Our adversaries are not thinking in those terms, you know. We're in trouble as the West. The West is in trouble. And we're either going to snap out of it and continue improving ourselves, or we're not going to like where we wind up.
Yeah, in Australia, there are definitely small pockets of people who are trying to make the social issues in America an Australian reality. There's definitely small groups that are trying to do that. But I think in Australia, the population at large is a little bit more, I won't say cluey. I'll say it's not their top priority. So in Australia, Victoria, the state, agreed to a Belt and Road deal with China, and
Right.
the federal government have just ripped that up because it doesn't. It's basically the states playing international politics, and the
Correct.
federal government has gotten rid of that, which is, I think, a good thing because you don't want to. Put it this way, when you make a deal with a bear, you know you're probably not going to get the best end of the deal.
That's correct. Right. Can't make a deal with the devil.
Exactly. You've said that, and I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Um, some people who in Australia who talk about liberty and freedom and other things like that are doing political activism more in a Saul Alinsky sort of social Marxist sort of method. Can
Hmm.
you get anywhere good by using these tools from these negative worldviews?
I don't think so. And the reason is the Alinsky method, which is one corner of what I call Marxist dialecticalism. The Marxist dialectic, the way Marxists pull down governments, and they're good at it, they're very good, they have it refined now, is they create a dichotomy. So there'll be a crisis, real, imagined, or contrived. COVID, for example, real, imagined, or contrived. Does it make any difference? Nah, not really. They will start and get two groups fighting against each other. So they'll have X over here and Y over there, and they have X fighting Y back and forth, thinking that the other side's the problem, when in reality they're moving you to Z. And they know that. And so the whole Alinsky method, Saul Alinsky himself said, it's friction that makes the whole thing work. And the friction, you have to keep people in a state of constant division, anger, and chaos in order to make that work. You can't. Martin Luther King's goal over here during our civil rights movement in the late 50s and up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was peaceful resistance, nonviolent resistance. He understood the idea, the biblical idea: love those who despitefully persecute you and use you. Pray for them, pray and do not curse them. Okay, because they themselves will be victims of their own worldviews. I don't see you, and I know Dean Gocher, who's done a lot of work on diaprax and how change agentry works. Change agentry is just a formalized process that governments use to put through various projects. It's the same thing. It's divide, conquer, move people along, letting them think they're getting there on their own mental power, but they're not. They're being manipulated to a predetermined conclusion.
Yeah, in Australia, especially in the education system, I'm noticing that advocacy or change agentry is popping up in courses that you wouldn't expect. I mean, you might expect it in media or some sort of communications
Right.
course, but we're seeing it pop up in law. We're seeing it pop up in
Math.
social math. Yeah, everything.
Right.
Like this
Everything.
whole
Right.
idea of Saul Alinsky and the change agentry, they give it a nice sort of neutral term like advocacy. And then they teach it so that every profession is advocating for their specific group. And
Correct.
when you get everybody advocating, you don't get order, you get chaos.
That's correct.
Because
And
sorry, you go.
and it's designed because what they do is they merge two things. They merge method and motive. So, say your motive is to eliminate racism, and they say we're going to use this method. Well, if the method is bad, that doesn't mean your motive is bad, but it means you need to junk this. You know, when the horse is dead, remember to dismount. Okay. But they don't. What they do is they merge motive and method together, so you can't oppose the method without being accused of opposing the motive.
Oh, that's
And
interesting because in
yeah,
Australia, what we're seeing is the more radical left leaning side of government, in combination with media, accusing the more conservative side of government, individuals, of things like historic sexual assault or mistreatment of women or misogyny. It's been a long running thing in Australia for the
right.
left to accuse the right of those sorts of things. Um, and their solution is fire the guy, get him out of his position. It's almost like the left are handing the right a knife and saying, go ahead, fall on your sword, gut yourself.
Right. And you have to think about that. They say we're opposing racism. Remember what I said about Martin Luther King's approach? You have to love the other side and win them over by your not just conduct, but by reasoned argument. What they are trying to do is to destroy the other person as an example to make everybody else not speak up and not oppose their methods by merging method and motive. If you oppose the method, then you're opposed to the motive. And if you do, here's what we're going to do to you in the name of being tolerant. So you have to catch this. So if I'm trying to convince you, say I think you're a big racist bigot, if I get up in your face and yell, you're a bigot, and yell at you and fire you from your job, are you convinced anymore that I'm right? No. As a matter of fact, the odds are you're pretty hardened into your position now. And you're thinking, well, you blank, 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 I'm going to get you at the earliest opportunity. See, so this has nothing to do, believe me, the idea of race and the other things that are being used are simply a vehicle, a crisis, real, imagined, contrived, that they use for a deeper political goal, and that is the destruction of the society and its transformation. You'll hear those words all the time: transformation of the society and the rejection of it. Don't be fooled by that, but a lot of people are. Let's face it.
So let's circle around a little bit and go back to the Christian worldview. Back in, say, the Reformation, 15th century or 14th century or 16th century, I can't
16th
remember how
century,
it
right? Yeah.
works.
Yeah, it works
Um,
weird.
so you had a revamp of studying the scriptures, which is one of those things. The Christian scriptures are one of those things that are a mark in the sand that doesn't move. It's a reference point. And as political thinking developed in Europe and Britain, certain subsets of the Christian worldview came out of that, and I would consider that to be classical liberalism and the idea of conservative politics. Would you agree with that?
Yes, the early humanists were Christian humanists, Erasmus of Rotterdam and others. It wasn't until later, after the experience of the existentialists, beginning with Søren Kierkegaard, tried to prove the existence of God by using reason and logic, not starting with revelation outside the universe and working in, but rather starting from reason and working out. That's what got us into this whole mess several hundred years ago. They switched that. They hijacked Christian humanism and moved it into secular humanism. That's where the change occurred. So what came out of the Protestant Reformation was a switch from the idea that in order to have law, you had to have a king, and that he was ordained by God to do X, Y, Z. And the only way to get to God was the church. So, and of course, to go through the church, you went through your priest, who went through the bishop, who went through the pope, and they dispensed sacraments on down and vice versa. The Reformation said, no, we're all responsible as individuals. You know, Martin Luther wrote on the freedom of the Christian man. We're saved by grace through faith in Christ. We're not dependent upon anybody else to do that. You don't have to have all these sacraments. You don't have to step through all these hoops that had been added over the years. And they had been added. They were not there in the early church. And so they went back to the foundation of the scriptures. That created the idea that I'm responsible before God, but I also have a tremendous amount of freedom as well to perform. Like, remember Jesus, the parable of the talents. He gave one guy 1 talent, 5 talents, 10 talents. And the guys with the 5 and the 10, they went out and did some stuff with it. Okay, I'm going to do some stuff. Yeah, there's a risk. It's a little dangerous here. I could lose it, but I'm going to try to make more. Whereas the man with 1, oh boy, I'm just so afraid I could lose this. And he just buried it. I mean, he didn't even put it with the bankers or with an investment broker who could have at least multiplied it, you know. That's where we started into where we are. Also, the idea of the value of individuals came out of the Protestant Reformation, that every individual, born, unborn, of all different ages, of all different groups, had value. Now, it took time to work that out in culture and in law, but we did work it out, and it is unique. There's a terrific book out by a Spanish author, Cesar Vidal, called A Changing World, Patriotism in an Age of Globalism. And he starts with that. The first part of the book, he lays the whole history of Western philosophy in a very readable fashion. It's intriguing when he does it. From the Middle Ages, starting with the reintroduction of the Greek philosophers into the West and into Christian theological thinking, then into the Reformation, and how it set the groundwork for the freedoms we enjoy today. Go ahead. I'll let you talk.
I was going to say that if conservatism is a gun, in that it is effective in the culture wars, the bullets of that gun is the Christian idea of morality.
Correct. And
So,
or reality.
yeah, so the
Okay.
natural
Right.
law is where I'm going. And so, in order for modern day conservatives or people who consider themselves classical liberal today, you know, reading people like Frederick Bastiat or the Federalist Papers or the things that created the modern West as a free democratic society, if they want to get back to that, I perceive that they're going to run into trouble if they don't reconnect with the Christian worldview.
That's
because
correct.
because the power that comes from their position and their thoughts actually has um, it's almost like a hollow um, just it loses all its power if you disconnect it from the Christian scriptures and the Christian worldview.
Yes. Let me ask you a question. We talk a lot. I'll give you an example. We talk a lot about human rights. Everybody's parading around nowadays by parading human rights. Everybody says humans have rights. Put up your hand. Who says? Who says so? They will say that, say, for example, colonialism is wrong. This is the big bugaboo as part of that. And I go, well, isn't that how it's supposed to work? I mean, you're telling us in the schools that we come from nothing, we go to nothing. We evolve by random processes of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Now, if one racial group can subdue, enslave, or eliminate another racial group, well, it would seem that's the way it's supposed to work, right? Where do you get this idea about human rights? Unless you root that in God, the answer is the government gives you your rights. Well, if the government gives you your rights, the government can take your rights away, right? They can just declare your rights. And even the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which everybody likes to parade around, it always reminds me of, Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich with meeting with Adolf Hitler saying, we're going to have peace in our time. This document guarantees it. And within less than a year, they were at war, right? If they don't get back to that foundation, then government is anything that it says is right. And we had a thing over here about same-sex marriage, and Christians were parading around saying, marriage is between one man and one woman. And I said, I will say, and who says? And they say, God says. I said, excuse me, but marriage is anything the state says it is. Why? Because the churches let go of marriage and deeded it over to government back in the 1930s. Once you let it go, then it's up to the state to determine what it is. And so I said, you can parade around all you want, but if half the country doesn't believe in God, they don't care. They don't care what this God of yours said. So you're right. The further we get from that, and, we have, there's a thing called, we have the Rocky Mountain chain that runs along the backbone of the country. Actually, it runs all the way from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego in Chile. But it's the Continental Divide. And my wife's hometown was right on the Continental Divide there. And it goes up to about 3,000 meters, before it splits. And there are two streams as you cross over Berthoud Pass. There are streams on either side of the divide. And these two streams, very close to each other, when they first start out, everything looks pretty much the same. You're in the same territory. One of those streams will flow into the Atlantic. One will flow into the Pacific. So as you start, everything looks okay. Your government hasn't changed too much. Your freedoms haven't changed too much. But the further you drift apart from that watershed, the worse it gets. And finally, it just doesn't look like anything else. And so people will say, well, that'll never happen in Australia. That'll never happen in America. My first question is, what will stop it? We're on a path. We've abandoned the foundations. What will stop it? And they just stare at you. Well, I just don't think it'll happen. I mean, that's what they say. And
Wishful
it
thinking.
has happened. Wishful thinking, right.
Yeah, because I see a lot of people in Australia talking about human rights, like you've said. But at the same time, in Victoria, a law was passed, an anti-conversion law for LGBTI people.
Right.
Basically, the focus seemed to be on Christians evangelizing homosexuals and trying to help them to repent, so to speak, from their homosexuality.
Right.
So the law that was passed makes it an offense to even pray at the request of the homosexual for their feelings, their thoughts and feelings. Do you kind of get what I mean?
Yes. And what has died in that transaction? There's one word.
You'll have to.
It's an F word. It's an F word. It's not
Freedom.
a bad word. Freedom. Right. What if
Exactly.
I'm a gay man and I don't want to be gay? In other words, I reject this. You've now restricted my freedom and my rights to do what? To solve the deal of one little group. See, we're using little groups to hold entire civilizations captive to that. I mean, who cares? If you want to do that, do that. Go ahead.
So the thing that I wanted to get to was that Victorians are up in arms completely about the abuses of their human rights because of the lockdowns and other things like that. But when this kind of law gets passed, very few people speak up. It's almost as if the modern day person who thinks about classic liberal thinking or conservatism um, is basically about themselves. It's whatever's good for me. But if it's a law that's passed restricting someone else's rights, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I don't care. Whereas the human rights as a concept, it's either everybody's human rights or it's no one's human rights.
It has to be uniform. It has to be a level playing field. And you're right. If you notice, and I'm sure you're having similar issues with Native Australians, we have Native Americans, African Americans, Native Canadians. Um, Everything's being flipped in that what it works out is that certain groups get rights, other groups don't get those rights. It's very convoluted thinking. God tells us you can't do that. Woe unto those who call evil good, good evil, and light dark, and dark light. Don't flip this over by this redefinition that you're going through. And God understood. It's why he said woe, and it's several times in the scripture. Woe unto people who do this. Because God understood that it undermines the entirety of the morality of a society. And we're seeing that. And so we hear that only whites can be racist, certain minorities can never be racist. Our problem is whiteness. If you ask them for a definition, I've never gotten a clear definition of what whiteness is, because we're actually told that blacks who dissent have too much whiteness. And I'm thinking, well, this is interesting. And fortunately, there are a lot of blacks who are saying the same thing. You know, they're thinking, okay, they're thinking about this doesn't make any sense. When I had a pastor on my show who was advocating this, and I said, well, what is whiteness? Is it Western civilization? And he said, well, no, it's not Western civilization. I said, well, is it the color of my skin? If I'm white, I have whiteness. He says, no, you can be black and have too much whiteness too. And I said, well, what is it? And he thought for a second. Well, I don't know, but don't you get it? I mean, I never forgot that. Don't you get it? Well,
It's
no, I keep asking you to tell me what it is.
it's funny. It sounds like to me related to that Marxist idea that all the proletariats somehow will realize that now this is the time to uprise. Oh, and there's no sort of activating factor. It's just this mystical sort of all the proletariat uprise at the same time, and this whole mystical thinking and talking in metaphor. It's just
Yes. Yeah, that's
it's
what it
very
is.
hard to understand. And when you talk to someone who speaks like this, they're shocked that you don't get it when you ask them to explain.
Right. They're
And
fun
it's,
to play with.
yeah. So, we've got about 10 minutes to go. I wanted to get into the area of persecution because where I see Australia and also the stuff that's going on in America and the UK and Europe, I'm seeing a persecution basically worldwide of Christians. There are other groups that are being persecuted, obviously, but it seems the West is particularly nonchalant or not really concerned about the Christian persecutions. And in my perception, like what I said before, if we're going to have a return to classic liberalism or conservatism, our relationship with Christianity uh, needs to be a little bit more active in that we protect Christians.
Right. Remember that persecution is always a collision of worldviews.
Yeah, that's right.
And right. And there's formal persecution in which a state tries to enforce a worldview on churches. That's formal persecution. Informal persecution is where the mob down the streets decides that you've said something against Mohammed and we're going to beat you up. Okay, that's informal persecution. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. Um, where Australia is, based on conversations I've had with you, I interviewed a couple of people from New Zealand, talked to people in Australia. You are where we were in the 90s. Things seemed better. The church wasn't really too concerned. It didn't see the big green dragon coming. And there were only a small group of people that actually did. So you're right. Persecution will always be an attack on your faith, an attempt to get you to apostatize from that faith. And so there are skills that you have to have, and you do need to know what they are ahead of time in order to keep your faith intact during that time. And the first question is, what are you willing to throw on the table for your faith? Is your faith something that fits into your life, or does your life fit into your faith? Are you willing to put everything on the table for Christ? That means your life, your property, your marriage, your household, and your freedom. How much of that are you willing to go before you spit in the face of Christ? That's always the question that I ask. And throughout history, large numbers of Christians have been more than willing to turn on Christ when it came to a time of persecution. So it comes up on you gradually, but when the moment of trial comes, it will come on you very, very quickly. And if you don't know what your answer has been or will be, you will get taken and you will fall. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get up again, which is a very important thing. I say, if you fall, get up, which is exactly what Jesus said to Peter when he told him, you're going to deny me here, guy. He said, but when you've recovered, because remember, Peter went out and wept bitterly. He had betrayed his best friend. And Jesus said, when you recover, go and strengthen your brethren. They're going to need you. Okay. So that's the situation that we're facing in the West. It's getting stronger and stronger. In this country, there have been open protests against lockdowns. Churches have refused to shut. There is a church north of me in Alberta, Canada, where the pastor refused to close. He was put in jail, and they let him out, but then they put up a big chain link fence around his church so people couldn't go into the church. Ontario province was just locked down last Saturday, and the Premier of Ontario, they even put roadblocks between Ontario, at the border of Ontario and Quebec, and Ontario and Manitoba. So I had calls from listeners of the show in Ontario saying, we're living in a police state. You know, they're not letting us do anything. They're telling us what we can do and can't do. And but always remember that your persecution is going to be on your faith and to try to get you to apostatize from that, at least on your Christian faith.
Yeah, like when you think about the people doing this in government, in Australia and in the UK, it's the conservative parties that are in power federally, and they're giving in to these directions, I would say, to these globalist organizations like the EU or the UN or the World Health Organization or other things like that.
Right.
And so the persecution is not only of Christians, it's of the subset from the Christian worldview, i.e. the conservatives, the classic liberals, even down to men, the people group of males. So in Australia and in America, you've got this concept of toxic masculinity. And so how can one identify, like there's co-opting and there's coercion is a method of
Persecution.
persecuting. So can you
Right.
go through some stuff to help us understand when we're being co-opted and when we're being coerced?
Coercion is overt. You will do this, or we're going to fire you from your job. We are going to put you in prison. We'll confiscate your money, your goods, break up your family. That's coercion. Co-opting is the dangerous part for Christians. It comes on gradually, and a lot of Christians don't see it coming, and it just demands little compromises all along the way. It's a death by 1,000 cuts as you go along. That's the co-opting part. In many cases, they convince people, there are groups, and I say masquerading as Christian organizations in politics, saying, oh, well, we're evangelical or we're Pentecostal, but we believe X, Y, Z. They're not. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. And that is the co-opting part. They actually get you to go along with it. without, and so I always say that, like there are three categories in the activist mindset. Number one are the great and good. They are. Number two are conservatives. Those are people who object and demand a few changes here and there, but don't get in the way. The radicals, as they will call them, the extremists, are the ones who say, this is stupid, this is dangerous, and we're not going there. End of story. They will call you radicals. And you notice it was something you just said, I can't remember what it was, that was really prescient. And the idea of how they frame things. Things are always framed in such a way to put you and me on the defensive. It's the framing of the argument, right? It's the framing of the argument that gets you. And so if you, again, motive and method, if you oppose the framing, then they claim you're opposed to the motive as well. And you're not. I don't think you or I are in favor of oppression of groups. We're not in favor of slavery. We're not in favor of racism. But there is, if you don't take it the way we want you to take it, then that's it. That's the it's a combination of coercing and co-opting.
Yeah, there's a quote from Frederick Bastiat that he says, I'll have to paraphrase because I don't have it with me, but he says his version of the liberals, his version of the left, say that just because we oppose government controlled education, they say we're opposed to education for everybody.
Correct.
And so the language that gets used is very sneaky, and it does tie you up in knots, and they're very good at getting you to cower in a corner just with their words.
Unless you know how to punch out of that corner.
Yeah, and so that leads us into what I want to end on, which is what can we do personally to be better equipped with the tools that we need to function, defend our families, and maybe do a little bit of pushback if we have the opportunity. One of the things that I've been advocating is going back and reading older books like Gulliver's Travels or Robinson Crusoe, and understanding how language worked and what the culture used to be like, and the things that were good about classic liberalism, conservatism, and the history of the West. So that's what I've been saying. But do you have any other ideas or things that practically that we can do individually to give us tools?
That's a good start. There are some agencies, or I know in our country, some ministries or other nonprofits that are doing just that. They're taking people like Bill Federer's America's God and Country. In other words, where he talks about how were we founded, what were the things that the people did and said, what did we argue about, how did we get to where we are today in a positive vein. Understanding that history is one good way of doing it. So, for example, as far as our country, they'll try to tell us we're a no good, very bad, perfectly awful, horrible, racist, xenophobic country. Based on slavery, there is no absolution, no amount of penance that you can do. That's nonsense. Okay? It was the Anglosphere that abolished slavery. It took time to do that, Joshua. And you have to go back and read what the people said during the debates of the time. We're standing today on the construction of what they built up for us over the last 500 years. And today's radicals say, because we weren't perfect from the beginning, therefore everything is rotten. Well, that's nonsense. You talked about LGBT rights, etc. I have pointed out to a gay friend of mine, actually a gay family member, I said, you have to admit, we hear all of this about gay rights, but most of your gay rights organizations don't give a rip about what's happening to gays inside the Islamic world. I mean, gays are being imprisoned, put in concentration camps, tortured, hung from cranes, thrown out of buildings, etc. I don't hear the protest. Where is this? We talk about slavery. There is slavery today on the African continent and in Asia. I don't hear them talking about it. If they're not talking about it like that, that means that it's only an excuse for a deeper agenda. For every double standard up on the surface, There is a single standard that's hidden underneath it, and you just have to look for it. But going back and understanding, read history books. And I don't mean dull history. I listen to more books than I read because I have to read so much for the business. I listen to the history of great people, of what they did, of the arguments, of how things were settled. How did we make it up to the Civil War? What were the arguments that they used? What did they dispute when they were writing our Constitution and our Bill of Rights? How did this come about? Unless you understand that, you don't understand the platform that you're standing on. And you can bet those cultic-like people in postmodern thinking don't have a clue about any of that. All they're doing is ingesting it. And as you said, even in public schools, even in math questions, they're putting politically charged questions in the verbal problems that you would solve in mathematics. That is a total system of indoctrination. That's what it is. That's why, and I'm not sure how big the movement is in Australia, but over here, our homeschool group or movement has been growing for 30 years. We homeschooled all three of our kids, and they're doing exceptionally well. People are more and more flooding into homeschools and good private schools as they realize when we've had that the public schools are not up to no good. Parents have had their eyes open when they realize that the schools were saying we don't want parents to watch the classes they're getting online during the COVID shutdown. Okay, well, or you can't record them. And then the parents began going, wait a minute. You mean I can't watch the classes my kids are? Why not? Well, they don't want you to know. That's why not. So the good thing is they're more and more and more out in the open. The trick is making everybody on our side realize how evil this is and the danger that it represents to faith and even to the structure of society. And it's sometimes frustrating. It was frustrating for me in the 90s when we first started on the radio show to keep saying, wake up, wake up, wake up. And to have so many pastors say, sit down, sit down, sit down. Don't worry about it. Nothing to worry about. He's extreme. Okay, well, they were wrong. I was right. I'm sorry that I'm right. It would have been nice if they had been right, but I'm right. And now for us, the time of trial is upon us. And even now, pastors are having trouble pivoting to address the issues. But you and I can still do it. See, you and I can talk one-to-one and to anybody that listens about what we can do, about how we got here, why it was good, why we acknowledge our faults, and why we should stay where we are. And the alternative they're offering is nothing, Joshua, but repackaged Marxism, socialism. It's all failed miserably dozens of times in the history of the world. You don't want to go there.
Yeah, that's what I like to tell people about the Christian worldview. Essentially started 2,000 years ago and has been consistently tested, pored over, tried. The faults have been found. The illogical thinking of how to apply it has been found and worked through. And these Johnny-come-lately worldviews like Marxism and secular humanism think just because of putting all their bets on Darwin and saying we're going to put everything on black, so to speak. And
Right.
Darwin has largely, they've got holes in it. I mean, Stephen Myers and other people are showing that this idea of pure materialism is just not intellectually coherent anymore.
It cannot stand. I talked to Stephen. You should bring him up. I just talked to him last week. And we had dinner about 2 years ago. And he said the real true evolutionists and geneticists, they realize they're in trouble, that their worldview, as they have been teaching it, that, it was random mutation, they created this, isn't going to work. They can't explain the origin of information in the DNA structure of the cell because information implies intelligence. They know they're in trouble, so what they're doing in the popular media, we're being told that all of this stuff is still true, and when the species evolved out near Ayers Rock, blah blah blah, 42 million years ago, blah blah. They don't know that. This is some logical readback. It's philosophy, not science. And what they're doing is they're beating the drum over here while they're saying, "Quick, Charlie, think of something," because they
I love that. Yeah.
But Stephen Meyer told me last week, he said, nevertheless, that teaching has wrecked the faith of thousands and thousands of Christian young people. It has wrecked it. So,
Well, I think the good thing is that for the inquisitive mind, someone who is committed to pursuing truth, despite what everybody else is saying, you can find it, you can learn it, and you can navigate the environment, the political environment, so that you can not only educate yourself, but be part of educating your children
right,
so that maybe this generation, and this is my hope, that this generation, because they've realized that the Marxists and the secularists are emperors with no clothes,
correct.
this generation could be the start of um, a not a return, but a progression back to um, being able to think and talk with each other, because that's ultimately where peace comes from. When two
Right.
people, regardless of how much they agree, can have a conversation with each other and leave better for it.
That's correct. And this whole system, I guarantee, there's an old thing from New Orleans, I guarantee, all right, I guarantee that it is going to collapse. And when it collapses, a lot of people will be looking for answers. Believe it or not, a lot of the people trapped in that postmodern method of thinking would like to get out. And when they see that we're on the other side, that number one, we care about them and love them, and number two, we have some answers, they start to take steps to moving to the door. And as soon as they know it's safe to make the jump, they'll make the jump. So when it collapses, somebody better be there with the answer. And there you are, sitting right where you are in Australia.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate the time that you've given me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. It's not often that I'm able to talk with someone that has those foundational concepts so that we can talk a little bit higher than what I normally would.
Well, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing, because there's coming a time for Australia. People will have to remember what it was you said. As I said, you're where we were about 25, 30 years ago. We're further down this road. And but it will come. No, there is that time coming.
So, how can my audience get in contact with you and your show if they would like to follow up with Steel on Steel?
Now, why would they like to do that?
Why wouldn't they? I mean, I think a good resource is worth its weight in gold. And as I said, I've been a subscriber to Steel on Steel for 15 years now, and I've never regretted it. It's helped me enormously. And
Well,
so, go.
we have a daily podcast at steelonsteel.com. We're on most of the major podcast engines. We got off of Apple for a while, but it looks like we may get back on. But if you go to steelonsteel.com, everything you need to know is there. I encourage people on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, we have a page, Praying for Persecuted Christians. And it's a members group, doesn't cost anything, but we keep regular reports going up about the persecuted church, because they do need prayer. And you do need to understand what Christians are going through in other countries, especially in Asia and Africa, more than anything else. We are so privileged in the Anglosphere, in the prosperity and freedom that we have enjoyed. I don't think we realize how dangerous it is that we're getting close to this edge of getting pushed off of it. But at the very same time, you have to realize that freedom and prosperity are a fluke in history, not the norm. And if you want to see the norm, go to see where Christians are persecuted throughout the Islamic world. Even as Muslims themselves in the western part of China, Uyghurs are being persecuted by the communists. And also in the communist world, in China and in places like North Korea. We need to know what they're going through. We're instructed to pray for those and to help those in chains. as if we were in chains with them. So Praying for Persecuted Christians on Facebook. If you want to listen to our daily podcast, it's steelonsteel.com, just like the metal, Steel on Steel.
John Loeffler, thanks heaps for your time, and I hope that you have a great day.